welcome to this explainer. Think about how carefully people curate their social media feeds today, right? Just projecting this absolutely perfect life. Now, I want you to imagine an entire empire doing exactly that, but during a brutal, totally chaotic war. Today, we're diving into a fascinating historical investigation into the 1914 Lublin Campaign on the Eastern Front. We're going to uncover the stark and honestly shocking contrast between the sanitized, official archival records of the Austro-Hungarian military and the harrowing lived realities on the ground. On one hand, you have these carefully composed photographs from the Austrian state archives meant to project absolute control. But on the other, you have the raw, visceral diaries of soldiers, medics, and local peasants who actually had to survive the chaos. It's a classic case of the official lens versus the reality hiding just out of frame.
Let's kick things off with a raw account from a local Polish peasant named Jan Zajauch from the village of Tarnawka. Instantly, he immerses us in the terrifying sensory reality that the official records so often hide. Just imagine trying to bring in the urgent summer harvest, right? But you're feeling the ground literally shake beneath your feet. Zajauch described this as the groan of cannons, this low, terrifying rumble as the Austro-Hungarian First Army advanced. It was a sense of existential dread that completely paralyzed the local community.
So it makes you wonder, when an empire goes to war, how on earth do they document a reality that is rapidly spinning out of control? Well, as we'll see, the answer is often pretty simple, by pretending the chaos just doesn't exist. Our challenge today is to look right past that sterile camera's lens and find the true, unfiltered human experience.
All right, Section 1, Archduke in the Archives, the official lens. Let's look at how military leadership tried to project a mirage of total control. The Austrian state archives labeled a pristine image from this era. Archduke Joseph Ferdinand receives the authorities of Lublin. Sounds exactly like a peaceful, polite, diplomatic garden party, doesn't it? It projects complete stability, total control, and a perfectly smooth administrative transition. But as the archival notes themselves warn us, these original historical titles are deeply sanitized. They completely fail to reflect reality. Because reality was far less polite. If you zoom out from that manicured official view, you find a vastly different perspective from the Allied officers actually fighting in the mud. Take Bernhard Stolberg, an ordnance officer for the German Landwehr Corps. He deeply resented this detached leadership. In fact, he bitterly referred to the Austro-Hungarian High Command as desk scholars. These commanders were absolutely brilliant at moving flags around a map in theory, but when it was time to roll up their sleeves and face the brutal kinetic reality of the front, they were nowhere to be found. Section 2, Ulan patrols and reality. Let's see how this facade held up for the cavalry on the front lines. The archives present us with this incredibly crisp, noble-sounding title, Ulan Patrol near Lublin. It instantly brings to mind dashing cavalrymen, highly organized military maneuvers, and a tactical command of the battlefield. It's the exact kind of flawless image an empire wants to broadcast to the world, to show that its military machine is operating perfectly across the landscape. But the disconnect here is just staggering. While official descriptions boast about these orderly patrols, the truth was desperate. Failing infantry assaults documented by officers like Stolberg on the ground. He wrote about personally leading a frenzied night charge on Russian trenches at Tarnawka, only to turn around and realize he was entirely alone with just one lieutenant. His troops hadn't held the line at all. They had simply melted away into the night. And why was that happening? Well, the men deployed for these frontline assaults, specifically the older troops of the Landwehr Corps, were simply not physically or mentally equipped for the horrific stress of this new mechanized warfare. Stolberg actually noted that these older reserves had spent nerves. They just lacked the stamina of the younger soldiers, making them incredibly fragile under the grueling conditions of prolonged trench combat. It's a really tragic, deeply humanizing detail. Unlike those sterile, posed photos back at headquarters, the actual Battle of Krasnik in late August was a frantic, visceral nightmare, an absolute chaotic mess of smoke, bayonets, and desperate men fighting for their lives. Now, the Austro-Hungarian First Army did initially see a victory here, but it came at a tremendous cost of human endurance. It completely contradicted the calm, orderly facade the empire was working so hard to maintain. A commemorative coin honoring General Viktor Dunkel from this time really represents a command structure that was desperately trying to manage a rapidly deteriorating front. General Dunkel's First Army pushed forward aggressively under this pre-war hubris, a sort of cult of the offensive. They just assumed sheer willpower would win the day. But the vast, completely unforgiving geography of the Eastern Front quickly exposed their flanks and forced a brutal reality check.
When you lay out the timeline, it is wild how fast the whole illusion shatters. Late August, initial success at Krasnik. Early September, an absolute bloodbath at Tarnawka. And by September 11th, a massive, desperate general retreat officially begins. The fantasy of a swift, orderly conquest completely evaporated in just a matter of weeks. Which brings us to Section 3. The field post arrives, logistics and illusions. Because war isn't just about battles. It's about keeping a massive machine fed, sheltered, and connected.
The archives proudly label records of this as arrival of the field post in Lublin. Sounds super heartwarming, right? It suggests a really stable military administration where the trains are running on time and the soldiers are happily kicking back reading letters from home. It projects total logistical mastery. But what was the reality? The reality was a nightmare. Just listen to this exhausted account from Dr. Bernhard Bardach, a Jewish military physician with the Austro-Hungarian army. He describes their billeting in Tarnawka as unbearable. The wretched farmhouses they were in lacked chimneys entirely, filling the rooms with suffocating smoke and making it literally impossible to even stand upright. Medical staff were forced to sleep in freezing, drafty barns just so they could breathe. Zero comfort, just pure exhaustion. And when that massive retreat began, the logistical strain turned into outright panic. The rear echelon was pure chaos. Midnight fires sparked terror in the camps. It got so bad that Allied troops started turning on each other. Stolberg documented Austro-Hungarian baggage trains physically fighting German wagons for escape routes. It actually culminated in an Austrian lieutenant pulling a Browning revolver on a German underofficer just to force his way through the mud. Let's move to Section 4, Civilians in the Crossfire. What actually happens to the people whose backyards become a battlefield? The official records captured these tranquil, slice-of-life descriptions like Russian Jews outside their shops in Lublin. You get this image of locals just standing by their storefronts, seemingly totally untouched by the conflict. But this serene snapshot completely hides the impending doom that was about to wipe out the regional economy and displace thousands of people. Those exact shops, those farms, those lives, they fell victim to brutal scorched-earth policies. Retreating armies systematically devastated the region just to slow the enemy advance. The data here is staggering, over 1.8 million discrete regional units lost. And that's really just a sanitized archival way of saying nearly 2 million homes, crops, and livelihoods were intentionally burned to the ground. The human toll was immediate. As Jan Zayak recorded, the Russian government drafted local peasants right in the middle of the pressing summer harvest. So the entire region was stripped of its young labor force at the exact moment the fighting kicked off. This left the remaining families incredibly vulnerable to the approaching armies and the impending famine. Finally, Section 5, the harrowing aftermath. When the lumbering armies finally moved on, what was actually left behind? The sensory horror recorded by locals paints a picture of absolute desolation. Zayak described the fields littered with corpses packed together like sheaves of wheat, with nearly 100 bodies hidden just in one patch of high lupine stalks. The ground was so choked with shrapnel and iron it was impossible to even cultivate. And come the freezing winter, Russian police conscripted the locals to dig massive, 30-cubit-long trenches to bury the dead, forcing them to endure an unbelievable stench. Individual memorial cards for soldiers like Joseph Feitzinger and Johann Feldschmied really put a human face to these mind-numbing statistics. These were real men, farmers' sons in their mid-20s who fell in the fields of Krasnik and Turobin. Seeing their faces is a powerful reminder that beneath the broad strokes of military strategy, this war was an intensely personal tragedy for millions of people. So when we look through the neat, sanitized folders of official history, we really have to ask ourselves, whose truth actually survives and whose gets buried in the mud? Next time you see a pristine official photograph, I want you to ask yourself, what is happening just outside the frame? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and never stop questioning the lens.